But from a Deleuzian perspective, Howard's critique seals off politics purely into the realm of human bodies, as well as restricting thought, after Badiou, to rational processes of deduction, mathematics, and calculation. In contrast, while Deleuze and Guattari do suggest that we disorganize our bodies and do evoke the idea of reducing oneself to an abstract line, this is not a call for a process of dematerialization or disembodiment. Becoming a body without organs, for instance, should be understood as a form of participation, as adding to yourself rather than subtracting from yourself, or as the subtraction of that which prevents us from taking part in the life of the world. Whereas Howard arguably still thinks in terms of a dialectic between being or presence and the void or absence or mind, human politics or no politics, Deleuze allows us to think in terms of a body politic involving the extension of both human and inhuman bodies' powers of acting. Next. So to conclude, let us return to the issue of illness with which we began. Like those who inspired him, Spinoza, Nietzsche, and Artaud, Deleuze experienced a poor state of health through much of his working life, beginning in 1968 with the first major episode of the pulmonary illness that would dog the philosopher's body until his fatal defenestration in 1995. But what was the relationship for Deleuze between philosophy and illness, between thought and the body in poor health? In 1988, Deleuze took part in the 8 hours of interviews with Claire Parnay that constitute the film project called The ABC of Gilles Deleuze, including a discussion of the subject of illness under the letter M for maladie. Filmed in the apartment that would later serve as the setting for his suicide, a clearly frail 64-year-old Deleuze proposes that illness is not a mere object of thought. Rather, he says, a fragile state of health might have a secondary benefit of endowing us with a greater capacity to attune to the differential forces of life. He continues, clarifying, illness is not an enemy, not something that gives the feeling of death, but rather something that gives a feeling of life. But not in the sense that I still want to live, and so once I'm cured, I'll start living, but rather in the sense that illness sharpens a kind of vision of life, or a sense of life. It's not that one is tuned into one's own life, Deleuze says, but for him, it did seem like he was tuned into life, life per se, to a life, or impersonal life. Next. But why might this be? One answer comes from the link that Deleuze goes on to establish between thought and excessive affect. Drawing from the examples of D.H. Lawrence and Spinoza, whom Deleuze describes as having seen something so enormous, so overwhelming that it was too much for them, Deleuze then suggests that a degree of fragility might be what forces genuinely creative thought upon us. He argues, quote, one cannot think if one isn't already in a domain that exceeds one's strength to some extent, that makes one fragile. That is, whilst there are clearly degrees of fragility and ill health that have a disabling effect, there are others that can enable. Or as Deleuze implies in Nietzschean philosophy, summarized here by Paul Patton, quote, the same physiological state may weaken some powers, but also open up new possibilities of feeling or bring about new capacities for acting and being acted upon. Varying from case to case, illness can operate as both an active and reactive force to different degrees. As reactive force, illness narrows my possibilities, Deleuze says, and condemns me to a diminished milieu to which I can do no more than adapt myself. But in another way, he says, it reveals to me a new capacity. As active force, illnesses can also bring us new feelings and teach us new ways of being affected. Here, and in Spinoza, Practical Philosophy, Deleuze reveals the complexity of affective experimentation and the difficulty of the task of coming to know what our bodies can do. It is not simply that another body is good or bad for me. The so-called same body can agree with us in one respect and disagree with us in another. And/or what I once found disagreeable about a particular body can later come to agree with me as I age, as I become ill, as I become. The discussion of illness's positive effects also allows Deleuze to emphasize the distinction between power as physical force and power as puissance or capacity. The physically weak are not necessarily weak. On the contrary, they may live more at the limits of their power to affect and be affected than the physically strong. On the one hand, then, we can conclude that it depends on the one who is ill. It depends on how we react, having experienced too strong an excitation, as Deleuze puts it. The man of ressentiment reacts to illness by wishing for those in good health to become sick. Or if bad conscience takes over, my illness becomes my fault. But on the other hand, we can also conclude that any given illness is never the same. The illness itself is a body that is defined differently in each singular context. To affirm some philosophical benefits of illness in this way may well be deemed as romanticism, or indeed asceticism by some. But as Deleuze reports, it was another sickly philosopher, Nietzsche, who exhorted us to, quote, make of sickness an exploration of health, and to contemplate not one, but many healths with respect to bodies. Is this not the great health? Is this not what permits Nietzsche to experience a superior health at the very moment when he is sick? As Line de Bol puts it, for Nietzsche and Deleuze, sickness and health are not contradictions that exclude each other. Sickness is an embodied point of view, an exploration of health and vice versa. In their perpetual transformation, even in becoming breathless, in a human lung oxygen tank assemblage, bodies provide us with new ways of thinking and tune us into the other human and inhuman bodies thinking alongside us.